March 6th, 1997. The executives at Capitol Records and EMI are sitting down in this pristine boardroom to listen to the final master tapes of Radiohead's highly anticipated third album.
Right, which was OK Computer.
Exactly. And keep in mind, this band is coming off a massive, radio-friendly, alternative rock success. So the labels are expecting, another gold mine.
Oh, absolutely. They wanted hits.
Yeah, but the music starts playing, and the executives react with absolute horror. Like, they immediately declare the entire album completely uncommercial.
The panic must have been unreal.
It was so intense that they actually slashed their internal sales projections by 75% right there on the spot. I mean, dropping from an expected 2 million copies down to just 500,000.
It is basically the ultimate corporate nightmare. But the band's reaction to this panic is what really sets up the entire legend of this album.
Because they didn't compromise at all.
Exactly. Instead of returning to the studio or, trying to remix a catchy pop single, the band's management launches this incredibly aggressive promotional counterattack.
Oh, right. This is the Walkman thing.
Yeah, they execute something that came to be known as the Walkman track. They countered the label's low expectations by physically mailing out over 1,000 customized Sony Walkman tape players to key music journalists and radio directors.
Which sounds like a nice gift,
But there is a very deliberate catch. The OK Computer cassette tape was literally glued inside the cassette deck.
That is just so hostile. I love it.
Right. They made it physically impossible to fast forward, skip, or remove the tape. Like, the mechanism was jammed in a way where you had to experience the album exactly as the band intended, from start to finish, with absolutely no escape.
I want to focus on that defiance for a second, because the anti-radio hostility didn't stop with the superglue. They obviously had to pick a lead single to introduce this record to the world.
And they chose Paranoid Android.
Yeah, which is just wild. It's a 6.5-minute, multi-part, non-linear epic. It constantly shifts time signatures, it has no traditional chorus, and it completely abandoned standard pop structure.
It was a huge risk.
And to make it even more apparent that they were actively sabotaging their own pop success, we have to look at what they actually left off the album.
Oh, you're talking about Lift.
Yes. During these recording sessions, they had worked out this incredible soaring track called Lift. By all accounts in the sources, it was a guaranteed anthemic smash hit.
Like a massive stadium anthem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But they completely omitted it from the original album sequencing simply because they feared its massive commercial pop hit potential would completely ruin their artistic autonomy.
They looked at the mainstream arena rock stardom that Lift would bring them, and they were terrified of being trapped in it forever.
They were deliberately pulling the emergency brake on their own commercial momentum. I mean, they looked at the machinery of the music industry and decided to throw a wrench directly into the gears. Welcome to Deep Cuts and Deep Thinking. Today, we are unpacking a stack of musicological and archival sources to understand how an album designed to be intentionally difficult and uncommercial became the defining blueprint for late 20th century anxiety.
It really is the blueprint.
Yeah, we are going to explore the mechanics behind this music and why its specific themes of alienation and technological dread resonate so deeply with you, the listener, today.
Well, the transition from their previous album, The Bends, to this actively hostile Walkman gluing era is a massive pivot. I mean, The Bends was basically a masterclass in accessible rock.
Right. So how did they get so hostile?
To understand how they got to OK Computer, we really have to look at the severe physical and psychological burnout that acted as the catalyst. Like, throughout the 1995 and 1996 touring cycle, they were opening for REM and Alanis Morissette, playing these cavernous North American arenas.
Just endless touring.
Yeah, and Thom Yorke, the lead singer, he started suffering from this profound transit fatigue. He basically developed an acute spatial paranoia from the endless blur of highways, airports, and sterile hotel rooms.
It is easy to think of touring as this glamorous adventure, but based on these sources, the reality sounded more like being trapped inside a sensory deprivation tank.
That's a great way to put it.
Like a tank where the only input you receive is the low, constant hum of a jet engine. You were in a metal tube, then you're in a concrete arena, then a moving bus. You're just completely disconnected from the natural world.
That sensory deprivation is exactly what was happening. And when they finally returned home to the UK, they were hit with a totally different kind of claustrophobia.
Because of the culture at the time, right?
Exactly. This was the peak of the Cool Britannia movement and Britpop. The UK charts were heavily dominated by lad culture and bands celebrating this very retro 1960s guitar pop nostalgia.
Very inward-looking.
Right, and Yorke completely rejected that inward-looking, backward-glancing culture. Instead, he began drawing heavy influence from political theorists like Noam Chomsky.
Interesting pivot.
Yeah, he was particularly absorbed by Chomsky's writings on corporate hegemony and the manufactured consent of the public, the idea being that mass media and corporate structures subtly manipulate populations into accepting systems that don't actually serve them.
And just to interject, to be completely clear for you listening, we are simply reporting on the band's artistic and literary influences here to understand the lyrics. We aren't endorsing these political field poo points or theorists, just mapping out the specific ideas that were, filling the band's heads at the time.
Exactly. It's just the context of the art.
But this context sets up a massive creative problem. They didn't just want to write standard rock songs complaining about airplanes and corporations. They wanted to make the album actually sound like the hum of the machine itself.
Which is incredibly hard to do.
So I have to ask, how do you take physical transit toxicity and turn it into a musical arrangement?
Well, you certainly don't do it in a standard sterile recording studio. To capture that machine hum and completely escape the traditional Britpop rock sound, they realized they had to physically flee the traditional music studio system.
So in July 1996, they go to the most uncorporate place imaginable.
Oh, canned applause.
Yeah, they set up a makeshift studio in this space they called Canned Applause, which was literally an unheated, converted apple shed in Didcot. Like, it didn't even have basic plumbing.
Well, there's no running water. They literally had to use a chemical toilet.
That sounds miserable.
It was. But despite the incredible friction of working in a freezing shed, they actually tracked about 35% of the album's foundational material right there in the dirt. Being in that raw environment stripped away any lingering polish from their previous arena tours.
But obviously they couldn't stay in an apple shed to finish a highly complex record.
No. Eventually they had to move. They went to St. Catherine's Court, which is this historic 16th century Tudor mansion in Bath.
A bit of an upgrade from the shed.
Definitely. And this is where Nigel Godrich becomes absolutely vital to the process. He stepped in as a co-producer, and instead of setting up a traditional soundproofed control room, he utilized the sprawling architecture of the mansion itself as a massive acoustic processor.
Wow, okay, it sounds like they were treating the entire building like a giant, hollowed-out acoustic guitar body. The mansion wasn't just where they recorded, the mansion was the instrument itself.
Precisely. Like for the track Letdown, they recorded the instruments at 3 a.m. in the mansion's ballroom.
Why at 3 a.m.?
Just for the absolute stillness. They did this to capture the natural, massive reverberation of the space. When you play a chord in a room that big, the sound waves take time to bounce off the walls and return to the microphones, creating this vast, echoing atmosphere.
That makes sense.
And then for the song Exit Music, they recorded the lead vocals at 4 a.m. in a stone stairwell.
And the sources mentioned they were doing that specifically to get a natural slapback decay. Let's break that down for the listener. What actually happens to a human voice in a stone stairwell?
So, when you sing loudly in a tight space made of hard medieval stone, the sound wave hits the rock and bounces straight back into the microphone almost instantly. That fast, aggressive echo is what we call a slapback.
So it's not a long trailing echo.
Right. And because it's bouncing off cold stone rather than warm wood, the resulting vocal sounds incredibly isolated, ghostly, and just really harsh. They even utilized a vintage plate reverb unit for other parts.
What exactly is a plate reverb?
It is a literal massive sheet of metal suspended in a frame. You send sound into the metal vibrates, and microphones pick up that metallic resonance. Godrich just stuck this massive piece of metal in a communal hallway, so it was picking up the ambient life of the house while processing the music.
Wait, hold on a second. I'm trying to square this. If their whole goal was to completely escape the corporate studio system and protect their artistic autonomy, they're still relying on an insane amount of complex, expensive gear to pull this off.
Oh, a ton of gear.
Right. The sources detail them bringing in massive 24-track analog tape machines, vintage synthesizers, and incredibly heavy processed bass lines. If you have all this highly technical machinery sitting inside a 16th century mansion, how does Godrich keep the entire project from collapsing into total chaos?
Well, the secret is that Godrich didn't try to prevent the chaos. He managed it by treating the complex studio gear as unpredictable band members.
What do you mean?
The equipment wasn't just there to passively record the music, it was there to actively disrupt it. They would feed a pristine live performance into these machines, specifically to see how the technology would break or mutate or compress the sound.
Oh, the opening track, Airbag, is the perfect example of this. You have the drummer, Phil Selway, playing this very complex, energetic, live drum loop.
And a traditional producer would just record that drum kit and move on.
But instead, they record it, sample it into a Akai S3000 digital sampler, literally chop the audio waveform into pieces on a Mac computer, and then reamp that digital signal back out through the guitarist Johnny Greenwood's analog pedal board.
Exactly. They're taking a fluid human performance and forcing it through a digital meat grinder and then blasting it through heavy analog distortion.
The resulting drum track sounds metallic, crushed, and stuttering. It physically mimics the sound of machinery failing.
And if we connect this to the lyrics, Airbag is entirely about the illusion of safety in modern transit. You know, you are zooming down the highway in a metal box, completely trusting the engineering, but you are actually incredibly vulnerable.
Yeah, the drums sound exactly like a mechanical system on the verge of a catastrophic breakdown.
Speaking of systems breaking down, the studio accidents they kept on the final record are just wild. Like on the track Karma Police, if you listen closely to the final master, there's a low-frequency, steady hum running underneath the music.
Wait, I always wondered what that was.
That is the sound of an overworked kitchen refrigerator in the mansion. They just left the microphones open and kept the appliance noise in the song.
That is brilliant.
And the ending of Karma Police features this massive sonic collapse. They take a Roland space echo unit, which uses an actual physical loop of magnetic tape to create delay effects, and they push it into self-oscillation.
For those unfamiliar with that term, self-oscillation happens when you crank the intensity on a delay machine so high that it feeds the delayed sound back into itself over and over in an infinite loop. Right?
Exactly. The machine overloads, it starts screaming, and the audio pitch bends and warps. When they pitch shifted that overloading tape loop downward at the end of the song, it quite literally created the sound of a technological system collapsing under its own weight.
But the most terrifying system collapse on the album isn't a machine at all, it's an orchestra. Let's talk about climbing up the walls.
Oh, that arrangement is haunting.
To visualize the pure paranoia in that song, Johnny Greenwood wrote a string arrangement and recorded it at Abbey Road. He used 16 violins, but the instruction he gave the players was entirely unconventional. He had them play microtonal quarter tones apart from each other.
He was heavily inspired by the avant-garde composer Penderecki for that.
Right. And when Greenwood handed the sheet music to the classical orchestra, the players initially laughed because the score looked like pure chaos.
Because instead of playing standard harmonious notes, the string section was instructed to play the very tight spaces between the standard keys on a piano.
And when 16 violins do this simultaneously, the notes aggressively rub against each other. It creates severe acoustic friction.
Yeah, your brain interprets that tight dissonance as a suffocating insect-like swarm. It's deeply unsettling because it takes a traditional, beautiful instrument and just completely weaponizes it.
And if we are talking about weaponizing things, we have to talk about Fitter Happier. They literally used the Apple Mac OS 7.6 text-to-speech voice, the default digital voice named Fred, to read the lyrics.
Such a bleak track.
And the lyrics are just this corporate neoliberal wellness checklist. Fitter, happier, more productive, comfortable, not drinking too much. It perfectly captures the absolute terror of a fully optimized life where human beings are treated like software that needs constant updating.
What becomes clear across all these tracks is that the technology on the album acts as an atmosphere. Like, they weren't making a techno album and they weren't making dance music.
Not at all.
They were deliberately taking organic, emotional human performances and processing them through these cold, mechanical systems to make the feeling of modern alienation audible.
But wait, let's look at the contradiction here. By using the Mac OS voices and chopping up drum loops on an early computer, didn't they essentially invent the exact algorithmic aesthetic they were warning us about?
That is a great point.
I mean, they are screaming about the terrors of machines, but they are absolutely relying on the machines to deliver the message.
That tension is the core engine of the entire project, honestly.
Yeah.
They are deeply suspicious of modern technology, but they are simultaneously fascinated by what it can do.
Using the master's tools to dismantle the house, sort of.
Exactly. They are using the tools of the modern world to critique the modern world. And what's remarkable is that this tension wasn't just limited to the audio. It completely defined the visual packaging of the album as well.
Right, the artwork.
The artwork perfectly mirrors the digital exhaustion you navigate every single day.
Let's get into the visual art, because the album cover is iconic. Thom Yorke collaborated closely with the visual artist Stanley Donwood. They set up a digital design rig inside the mansion, right alongside the recording gear.
But they gave themselves one incredibly strict constraint.
What was it?
Working on this early Apple Mac, they were absolutely forbidden from ever using the computer's undo function.
Wow. Just think about the psychological impact of that rule. If they made a visual mistake, they couldn't just hit a button to magically erase it.
Nope. They were forced to manually paint over the error or obscure it with another digital layer. This process created what is known as a digital palimpsest.
A palimpsest being an ancient manuscript where the original text is scraped off to make room for new writing, but you can still see the ghostly traces of the old words underneath.
Exactly. So doing this digitally meant layering mistakes, digital artifacts, and harsh tears over each other until the image looked scarred, exhausted, and dense. It visualizes the feeling of carrying all your previous errors with you.
That no undo rule is wild because it is the exact opposite of our Control-Z culture today, where everything feels instantly correctable. You make a typo, you fix it, you post a bad photo, you delete it. We rely on that safety net.
And their rule forced them to live with their digital scars.
And all of these dense, chaotic layers are placed over that famous album cover image, which is a bleak, washed-out highway interchange.
Which is funny because that intersection was actually identified years later. It's the junction of Interstate 84 and Interstate 91 in Hartford, Connecticut.
Really? Hartford?
Yeah, it is the ultimate visual symbol of concrete, transit, and feeling trapped in a system you just can't control.
When you lay it all out like this, the uncorrected visual scars, the appliance hums, the digital chopping of acoustic drums, why do you think this raw, anxious aesthetic still resonates so heavily with someone listening today, even if they weren't around in 1997 to experience the cultural context?
It endures because it connects directly to the crushing pressures of your daily experience, like the exhaustion of being a commuter, the ambient anxiety of navigating endless transit, the pressure of corporate wellness checks demanding that you be fitter, happier, more productive.
We all feel those forces now more intensely than ever.
We do. And the album takes those universal, invisible pressures and builds an immersive sonic world out of them. It isn't just a collection of rock songs. It operates as a full diagnosis of the environment we live in.
And it resonates because it refuses to offer a simple, triumphant solution. The album ends not with some grand victory over technology, but with a stark warning about our relationship to speed.
Just look at the final track on the album, The Tourist. It is written in a very deliberate 9/8 time signature.
Which is pretty unusual for a rock song.
Very. In music, a 9/8 rhythm gives a piece this incredibly expansive, almost dragging, slow pace. It absolutely refuses to be rushed. Johnny Greenwood wrote it after he was sitting in a square in Prague, watching these frantic tourists physically rushing through their itinerary.
Just sprinting from monument to monument.
Right, trying to consume everything, but actually experiencing absolutely nothing.
The lyrics literally say, hey man, slow down. It is the ultimate counter-argument to that sensory deprivation jet engine we talked about at the beginning of the deep dive.
And the very final sound of the entire album is just a single, clean acoustic hit on a metal triangle.
Just one chime.
One chime that rings out, decays naturally, and fades away into silence. It brings all of that hyperacceleration, all the technological paranoia, and all the microtonal noise to a definitive sudden stop.
That sudden stop brings up a really crucial point about the prophet myth that surrounds this band. People constantly claim that Radiohead somehow possessed a crystal ball and literally predicted social media, algorithmic anxiety, or smartphones with this album.
But they didn't.
No. Instead, they masterfully diagnosed the conditions of late 20th century life. They looked at the bureaucracy, the obsession with optimization, and the emotional isolation of modern transit, and they documented it accurately.
And by doing so, they captured the exact cultural groundwork that eventually paved the way for a digital present. They didn't predict the actual hardware of the future. They predicted exactly how the hardware of the future was going to make us feel.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. Consider how Radiohead actually responded to the massive genre-defining success of OK Computer.
Oh, this is the best part.
They had just created the undisputed masterpiece of alternative guitar rock. They achieved exactly what the executives in that boardroom initially thought was impossible. But they were so terrified of the arena rock monster they had built, and so deeply afraid of becoming the exact optimized corporate product they spent the whole album critiquing, that they completely abandoned guitars for their next album.
Kid A.
Yeah, Kid A. They burned their own playbook to the ground. So did OK Computer actually destroy the guitar rock era? It is so famous for forcing music to mutate entirely just to survive the new millennium.
Sometimes to truly escape the machine, you have to break the very tools that built it.
If you like this episode, please like and subscribe.